its actual definition, orthorexia, is an obsession with healthy eating or healthy food, which seems like a little bit of an oxymoron. And yet, it's that word of obsession that is important to highlight in that definition.
Welcome to the Holistic Nutrition Hub podcast. Today I am here with Cindy, who is a registered holistic nutritionist, eating psychology counselor, and eating disorder recovery coach specializing in culinary nutrition and currently completing her functional nutrition certification. That was a really big mouthful. But what I want to do is just get you to introduce yourself a little bit more in depth about how you arrived at becoming a holistic nutritionist in the first place, and then why you chose eating disorder recovery as your niche, it sounds like.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me today, Lynn. I'm excited to be here. My journey to becoming a holistic nutritionist probably began as a child because I was always really into food and I always had a draw towards creating food and cooking. And I was a competitive gymnast for about 12 years growing up. And then after I left gymnastics, I developed an eating disorder, which lasted quite a long time, well into my late 20s, early 30s. And as I was sort of pulling out of that just naturally, for the most part, I actually had a cancerous tumor growing in my colon. So my child was a year and a half at the time, and I had to go in for this massive, very invasive, life-altering surgery, and came out of that really realizing that I had a lot of healing to do around my past with food, and the eating disorder and its connection to the health of my gut.
Mm.
And I was also just at a crux in my life and needed a new path. So I came across the Registered Holistic Nutrition program, and I started with that. And then as I was doing that training, I was also doing a lot of self-discovery and personal healing that really needed to happen. And so that led me further into the eating psychology program and then the eating disorder recovery program as well, because I just really felt drawn towards not only learning more, but being able to provide help and support and guidance for people who had been in my shoes. And I feel like we're so much more powerful as practitioners when we're able to come from a place of real life experience. So that's the short of it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I always like to say, like, we are our own ideal client, and like whatever experience that we've gone through that has helped us arrive here on our journey is the best thing that we can be doing in our coaching practice, even if it's really difficult for us at first to like kind of confront that aspect of us. I really do think like you don't have better experience than that, right? Like you've been through it, you've walked through those shoes, you have the message, you know some of the like pain points and some of the difficulties. And how is somebody supposed to listen to you, you know, in terms of a business kind of plan? How is somebody supposed to listen to you if they don't feel like you can relate to them? So I was wondering if you could dig a little bit more into how an eating disorder could relate to gut health, in terms of obviously your own journey, but like maybe explaining how eating disorders could even lead to gut health issues.
Yeah, I love that question. Well, eating disorders are so rooted in this disconnect between our mind, our mental health, and what's happening in the gut. And when we are in the throes of an eating disorder or a dysfunctional relationship with food, I like that term as well. It's a little bit more of an umbrella term. We we just really aren't paying attention to what's happening in our digestive system. We're not listening to cues of hunger and satiation. And in fact, we're doing the opposite. We're really turning those off. And so not only is there potentially overeating or binge eating and purging, which physiologically can create problems, um, but also there's this real severe detachment between the health of the digestive system and the health of the mind, and that really key gut brain communication
Mm.
of the vagus nerve, and that idea of being connected to our parasympathetic nervous system and relaxing the digestive system while we're eating and so forth. That's really not there. So when someone is eating in a state of stress, as we're quite well aware, now we tend to put a strain on our digestive system, and the digestive system isn't working as well as it should. And then we start to compromise its functions and our nutrient assimilation and all that as well. Never mind the food choice. So, if someone is eating the wrong foods or they're not eating enough foods, then that in itself can create problems in the gut.
Right. And then there's lots of nutrient deficiencies too that can be linked to kind of I don't want to say like recreating the symptoms of an eating disorder or something like that, but zinc, for example, like is in relation to like hunger cues and things like that as well, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So can you describe like what some of the different eating disorders are that we might come across when we're in practice or, um, you know, when we're looking online?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I really love to look at eating disorders from this place of a spectrum, because we've been trained as practitioners at least a little bit to understand what is anorexia and bulimia and binge eating disorder. Um, and yet there are all these other dysfunctional relationships on this eating disorder spectrum that we don't talk about that much. There's chronic dieting, there's binge eating, which I mentioned already, but there's in part binge eating, right? And then there's also one of the bigger, the elephant in the room is like this disordered mental relationship with food. So maybe there isn't existing an eating disorder that we can exactly pinpoint, and yet the person has this really unhealthy relationship with food. And then we have orthorexia as well. So I feel like there's a lot more terms now than there used to be. And as holistic nutritionists, we may see people with some of the cues that don't necessarily fall into an applicable clinical diagnosis.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Right, because like we see chronic dieting, we see, emotional eating, like all of those things. And it took a long time, like even for myself, it took me a long time to realize like I do kind of like binge eat when I'm feeling stressed out or emotional. And it's like, how can you have a better relationship with the food that you're eating, or a better relationship with your stress, or a better relationship with your trauma? Um, so you touched on some of the kind of blanket terms that we know very clearly, but what are some of the symptoms that might show somebody, as a practitioner, that there might be some kind of other symptom that kind of falls under this blanket term?
Yeah, I think we see a lot of anxiety and depression interconnected with a dysfunctional food relationship.
Mm,
Um, one of the biggest telltale signs, I guess you could say, is restriction or obsession.
mm,
And so obsession can look like something negative, and it can also present as something positive. And we see that on the other side nowadays with orthorexia, where there is this great obsession with healthy food or organic food or supplementation. And it may look healthy from the outside, but in fact, once we kind of dig a little deeper, it actually is creating a lot of stress and anxiety and upheaval on a deeper level.
Do you want to dive into that a little bit more? Because I feel like it's such a common thing that that we maybe don't think enough about, is the stress that we put on ourselves, where this might be relevant. Let's first of all maybe answer that question, like where this kind of I'm not going to call it obsessive patterns with eating, but like maybe being conscientious about what you're eating, like you've had food sensitivities or like allergies or gut health issues, and so you've been really focused on trying to rectify those issues, and then maybe it tumbles into something deeper than that, and you can have a lot of fear of like reintroduction and those sorts of things. So like, do you want to maybe just in your experience kind of, I don't know, dissect some of those topics?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the place I went to personally when I came out of my colon cancer experience and refused the chemo that was recommended to me, and instead went down this route of functional holistic medicine. And not only was I taking the program, but I was also reading massive amounts of information on cancer and holistic strategies. And then I was cleaning out my home, and I was cleaning out, my life, so to speak, completely changed. And I remember at one point having so many bottles of supplements that, I mean, I just didn't know which end was up. And I remember coming out of that a little while later and reflecting upon it and thinking, oh yeah, I did go through that, where you even when we study as nutritionists, you're like, oh no, I should be taking that, I must be deficient in this, and I see myself in those symptoms, and I see myself in these disorders, and what I think we really need to watch out for is when we feel out of balance or in a place of negativity with it. So it is a slippery slope, and information is power, and it's awesome, and it's everywhere, and we're inundated with it. So that's great. And it also can be a little bit of a hindrance for us, where if we reflect it back on ourselves, we may create a little bit anxiety, or feelings that we're not doing enough or being good enough with our practice and with our lives. And so I think it's important to note that everyone's individual balance of mental health, emotional health, physical health is just so unique and individual, that what may be healthy for one person might not be healthy for the next. And it's important to, cultivate awareness around your relationship with food and your relationship with supplements, with exercise, with, your dedication to your regular routines, etc. And constantly assess, am I in a place of balance? And if I'm not, what's out of balance, and how can I get myself back to a healthy place, a wholesome, happy place of balance with food? And I think that's really individualized, and we just have to be tuned in and present within ourselves enough to be able to recognize it.
Right. I feel like when we have all the ideologies that are kind of flying around in terms of like, this diet's perfect for you, this diet's perfect for you, you should be eating like this, and you need to be eating like this. And it's like, okay, well, step back just for 1 minute and let's see what everything else, like what else is going on with that person. First of all, something for me that comes like up is like wanting to ask you, like, what do you think is at the root of an eating disorder?
Yeah.
I mean, not like one thing, but like if you could sum it up, I don't know.
Yeah, it's a bit tricky and not. I mean, there are some key things And again, we come back to that thing of everybody's unique and individual. So what might have sparked an eating disorder in me is of course going to be different for someone else. Um, for sure, some things that are put us in a place more of risk than other things. For sure, trauma. So sexual trauma, we see a really high correlation between a young sexual trauma and the development of eating disorders. And that is really rooted, eating disorders are really rooted in this sense of wanting to find control in something. And so along that same vein, children who are raised in families with very controlling, restrictive parents, especially if there was any disordered eating happening within the home, especially with the mom, we really see a mirror reflection between the relationship between the mother and the child and what their food relationships ends up looking like. Because mothers are meant to nurture. They're our source of first food. And if there's tension, trauma, challenges there, it may present as an eating disorder down the line. And we also see very high correlation, which definitely rings true for myself, in young ladies, particularly who were in fitness sports, like aesthetic sports. I guess that's a term now, aesthetic sports. So gymnastics, figure skating, dance, ballet, those kind of sports where the body tends to, or we have this ideology about how the body should look when young women are in those sports. So there's a strong correlation there. And really, I think for what I see a lot with my clients is when they were raised in a home where they didn't have a very strong sense of safety, then I also see that as this correlation, which could also be, we could also call that trauma, right? I see a correlation in the development of an eating disorder later in life, and this drastic grasp at trying to nurture ourselves in the way that we weren't nurtured growing up. Yeah. So there's lots of things, and of course that's not everything.
No, of course. Yeah. I think the trauma piece definitely connects back to like what you were saying about being connected to your body, being aware of how it feels, being aware of like the sensations and the cues and all of those things. And just knowing what I know about trauma is like the disconnection between the body and the mind and then everything in between, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So what are some of the common signs and symptoms that maybe a practitioner should be like on the lookout for? We'll touch on like when you should refer out in a little bit, but like what are some of the signs and symptoms that maybe somebody who's coming to see you does have dysfunctional eating, let's say?
Yeah, good question. A track record of lots of dieting is certainly one. Like, I've tried this, and then I tried that, and then I tried this, and I did this, and I tried this, and someone who's always jumping on the next diet train is one. And also like someone who is really coming in for nutrition advice, looking to lose weight, who maybe doesn't seem like they need to lose weight. The other big one I would say is like that restriction mindful piece, where if the client is speaking about, I try to be good about that, but I can't do it all the time. Or, signs that someone is trying really hard to restrict and restrain themselves, and yet they indulge and feel really bad about it. Which is that's common in lots of people, but if that's really ringing really strong through the language, good and bad foods, this reference to good and bad foods, and really watching, I think paying attention to a negative self-talk that comes forward. And, I try to be good, but I usually can't because I have no willpower, or, right. That kind of language is good to pay attention to. I think we all have a little bit of it, or I should say, I shouldn't say we all do. I should say it's very common. It's very common to see at least some of that. But when it's really coming through in a strong way and it seems like it's doing harm.
Right. Right. It's not a positive thing. They're not doing it for their own good. Well, maybe they think they're doing it for their own good.
Mhm.
This kind of leads perfectly into like the next question, is like back to like the orthorexia, because I feel like you just kind of explained a little bit about what orthorexia is. Do you want to be really clear on what orthorexia is versus like binge eating versus anorexia, for example?
Yeah, its actual definition, orthorexia, is an obsession with healthy eating or healthy food, which seems like a little bit of an oxymoron. And yet, it's that word of obsession that is important to highlight in that definition. Whereas it's great to eat healthy, to make healthy choices, and to have balance. And when we start tipping the scales towards that unhealthy relationship, that imbalance where healthy food starts to become an obsession. So there's restriction, and there's limitations, and there is a relationship that develops there that is not relaxed and or potentially joyful around
Mm.
food. Yeah, and I think that's where, and this is a relatively new term. I don't know how long it's been around. I want to say maybe 15 years or something.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, so where we have seen, we've come a little bit out of the diet obsession, and we've moved towards this healthy food obsession as a society, which is generally a pretty positive shift. And yet we still see a lot of the same kind of behaviors and mentality that was existing with what we would call the diet mentality, that's now still there or prevalent in this more healthy food choice mentality. And so what we really want to look for is that when it becomes so much of an obsession that it's negatively impacting the person in other areas,
Right.
mind, in our mental health, in our emotional state, right? And the ability to be calm and relaxed around food, etc.
Okay. Because that's it. Like I have multiple stories, obviously, and I want to kind of dig into this because I think I've just before the call we kind of talked about this very very briefly, but in other conversations that I've had with holistic nutritionists, like we always kind of joke like, oh, maybe we do have orthorexia, or oh, maybe this behavior isn't actually really that great. And it's trying to figure out like the love for food and like nutrition and what should be balanced in our diet, and then trying to recognize like, okay, when is this becoming too much? And so like it's always been a really interesting conversation for me to kind of open that up, because I always wonder, is like, okay, I love eating healthy, right? I have my own health challenges, so I know that if I eat something that is going to trigger, like I know if I have a glass of wine, it's going to trigger like symptoms in me right away. My whole face will go red, like not just like rosy from drinking, but like a full on, like almost lupus, like butterfly. And I know it's like a direct thing, but then you have these people who are definitely for like the body positivity movement, and then also making sure that there isn't just a bunch of dysfunctional eating running around. It's like, how do you know? Because that's like always where I'm like pulled in two directions. Am I being too stringent with my health issues, or am I just where I should be? Because for me it's like I also have this pull to create better like food systems too, right? Whereas like I really believe the food that's being mass produced is completely unhealthy, and that we should have a better connection to our land and the food that we're eating, and know our farmer and all of those things. But then that's my obsession, but is that an unhealthy obsession? I clearly think too much. So that is where I wonder, I see so many of us with these kind of situations. It's like, okay, what is actually healthy and what's not? Do you see the same thing?
Yeah, I do. And I think where the add-on trainings that I've had beyond the nutrition training and even the functional nutrition training that I'm doing right now has really helped me as a practitioner be more compassionate and well-rounded and lenient and versatile. And I think that's really important because when you have a client come in and there's a little bit of these tendencies there, and I say, okay, well, we can definitely get rid of all these symptoms. You just have to do this this long list of things that I'm going to recommend, and off you go. And for anyone who struggles with imbalance or dysfunctional eating tendencies, um, I might set them up to fail, and I don't want to do that. Right. So one of the things that I do in my practice, and I'm going to get to the practitioner piece. One of the things I do in my practice is always work with the things that are easiest for my client to accomplish. Like what do you know you can accomplish? Like, we know you should probably not drink 5 cups of coffee, and we know you probably shouldn't drink this much alcohol, and we know you shouldn't be eating gluten. What of those things sounds like it's doable for you, right? And then we adjust from there and we move forward. And similarly, when we're evaluating ourselves, or we're trying to look after ourselves in the best way possible as practitioners, I think it's really important to have leniency and to have compassion towards the self and an ability to look within and cultivate awareness and around what our healthy balance looks like, and really be solid in that. And the more solid we are in that, the better we can show up for our clients. And maybe that is, for me, means that I'm never going to let go of coffee because I love coffee. And I know I shouldn't drink coffee, and yet I love it. And this is just an example. And it doesn't upset my system so much that I know it's doing more damage than it's doing good. And that piece of joy for me every day gives me more than it would to eliminate that from my diet, even though I know it's maybe not the best thing for me. And so I think always checking in. I love the obsession with farm food and local food and changing the food systems and advocating for a better food availability and distribution. Absolutely. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's
Just
about,
checking.
yeah.
Just
Yeah, I
checking.
think we all need to be kind of on the same rah-rah team for that, I would imagine. But yeah, I think when we can evaluate what's happening for us, and if that means that I have to be really restrictive around food because I have really nasty food allergies, and I know if I tip those scales, then I get right out of balance and it's hard for me to get back, then that's my truth. That's my healthy golden balance zone. And so as practitioners, we need to know where that is, and allow forgiveness, and notice when we have feelings of guilt and shame, which are like the hallmarks of dysfunctional eating. When we notice those are creeping in for us, then it's time for us to reevaluate. And is it that I have to tighten the reins, or is it that I actually have to start letting go a little bit? And that, that push pull is where sometimes we get lost.
I like what you said there in terms of, like maybe just letting go a bit. Like I talked about like ideologies, and like back to your point about like coaching simplicity. I think like that was really I think we often as practitioners kind of forget where we started, is like we were coming usually from our own health issues, and then maybe eating a standard American diet and then cleaning that up to help with our own health issue, right? That's pretty standard, I would say, across the board. And I think we forget that the majority of people are starting like either because they want to get healthy because of some kind of health condition, and that they're starting at the standard American diet, and that we don't need to put all of our experience as health coaches on top of them, including the long list of recommendations and the long list of like, this is what you have to change. And that's kind of back to that whole like, do we all have some kind of dysfunctional kind of relationship with what our journey kind of brought with us? And are we putting that onto our clients instead of maybe creating a plan that's specific to them?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it's an important thing to step back and evaluate, I think, and to notice and work with our clients like where they are, and not expect, them to be beyond their goals, and stick our own ideology of what we want, how we want them to succeed on them, and instead listening to what, because for some clients, they just want to improve a couple steps and that's good enough for them. And if that's good enough for them, then that's beautiful. Right.
I agree with you. Yeah. And I find like I'm going to go to like client, I don't want to say compliance, but like a client actually being successful and you helping them get from their goal to actually being successful. It is not by piling on a bunch of information. I definitely think like being as simple as possible with them at the beginning. It's also one reason why I advocate like nutrition coaching versus like meal plans or versus like this way of eating. Because I think that it just kind of takes out that bit of like, I want you to eat this way. And they can kind of take back that like emotional power towards their relationship with food, their relationship with like where they're even buying it, and like reconnecting that piece within themselves, right? Because I think that food is very cultural. Like it has to be interlaced within the culture. And because we've lost a lot of our culture, we've lost a lot of our food practices. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would absolutely, I would. And I think it's also been indoctrinated into us the idea of dieting, which then has morphed into the idea of idealism around food, instead of connectivity and balance. So yes, I agree with you. Do we all have some kind of dysfunctional eating relationship? Potentially, to a mild degree, because it's impossible for us not to have been affected by all the years of marketing and social media influence, and factory commercial business influence, etc. So yeah, that's the biggest challenge, is how do we get back to becoming intuitive with food and connected with our earth through food and each other. I mean, it's a long way back. It's doable, but it's a long way back.
I know. I was having this discussion. Actually, this is a really interesting topic, but I was having this discussion with my husband because it's like we hear the term ancestral eating, and we think back like when we hear that term, and I know it's thrown around in like the functional medicine realm quite a bit, is like ancestral eating was 20,000 years ago, maybe 200,000 years ago, and we're thinking of ourselves as like Neanderthals. But if we even just go back 100 years ago, 150 years ago, the majority of people were eating farm to table or, hunting meat or those kinds of things. And I think that there is a way to get back to that to be more sustainable, because obviously the world's grown quite a bit. But I like to think of like ancestral eating as being a term that we should be thinking about that is really not that far behind us. And there's a way to bring it forward. And we don't have to rely on these like factory farmed, and the more factory farm things that are coming, which is a whole other discussion.
Yeah, exactly. I know. I'm with you.
So what can people do if they think this is back to that question that I said that I didn't write and now I can't read it out. What
If they
should
think
people,
that someone they know might have an eating
yes,
disorder.
thank you. Listeners,
Yeah.
we obviously went through this question before and had the same problem.
Okay. It's fluid. It's good. I actually just sat on an eating disorder panel here in town in Nelson, where I'm living, with a bunch of dancers and gymnasts, which was organized by one of the dance studios, which was such a beautiful offering. And one of the participants we had a jar where they put their questions in the jar, and that came up a couple times actually. And I love that question because it's such an important one for young women to think about, to maybe spend some time moving around in their mind, and get some direction from adults or people, professionals who are in the industry. So, my advice, which I would stick to now, is that what's most important is to be there for them, to make sure that they feel loved unconditionally, and that they feel as though whatever they would want to say would be heard with compassion and without judgment. And I think that's one of the most important things. If this is someone and we're outside of talking about being a practitioner now, is that how you meant it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Um, there's no forcing someone into recovery. It doesn't work that way.
Mm.
They have to want it, and they have to get to a place of acceptance before they're ready. And if someone with an eating disorder in general, if they feel cornered or pressured, the likely response is for them to turn away.
Mm.
So I would advocate that the tone is soft, and any kind of pressure put on them to talk is also very soft and done from a place of love. And it's not always easy for us to do that, because sometimes we can get really angry with people who we love, who are harming themselves. And I get that. That's very real and it's valid. And yet it's not useful for the other person to experience. So just to be calm with it ourselves, to accept that we can't do any of the changing for them, and nor can we force them into change. And the best thing is to just make yourself available and make sure that they know they can come to you with absolutely anything.
Amazing. I like that answer. I feel like that's like how we should approach coaching in the first place. Like people come to us, we don't place judgment on them. They're able to come with an open mind and open heart to us. So we should have the same back to them. And I think that is something that I don't know if I figured out until much farther into my own practice. I mean, it's called a practice for a reason, right?
Mhm.
But I think that, like making sure that we just come at it with grace and, trying to walk them through whatever journey it is that they're kind of on at that moment. This kind of made me think of a question along the lines of like, what does a daily, not a daily, let's say, what does it look like to work in this sphere as a nutrition practitioner? Like what types of things, if somebody's thinking about getting into this niche, what would be kind of like your experience with it, and how do you work with your clients?
Yeah, I really got a lot out of the eating psychology program that I took. That was through the Institute of the Psychology of Eating. I did that a long time ago, and what I received from that was this idea, which you touched on earlier, which was becoming a nutrition coach, as opposed to just a practitioner. And I gained a lot of skills through that training, which really helped support me cohesively in my practice. So that would be one avenue that I would suggest, is some kind of add-on to the RHN training that involves furthering coaching or counseling.
Mhm.
And then the eating disorder recovery coaching program that I did, there are a few different options out there. I took mine through Dr. Dory McCubry. And there's also a woman who's putting on the same kind of training, and she comes from Vancouver, and I can't remember her name right now, but she has a couple of really great books. And so definitely getting certified to work with eating disorders specifically is really important. Just to have the basis of knowledge, what to look for when you're out of your scope, and then, some tools to lead you through working with your clients. And then as far as my practice goes, I work so individually with my clients. So some of my clients want a more nutritional information focus, and some of my clients really need more guidance in the emotional and the mental health side. So I kind of feel like I'm always there for them with whichever way they need to lean towards most. I always integrate worksheets into my work with my eating disorder clients. So those are body image, like self-love, self-care, just like reflective stuff, a lot of self-love practices and intuition practices. Because really one of the things we see a lot with eating disorders is just kind of like this loss of sense. This loss of self.
Yes.
Like, who am I and what are my foundational things? And I definitely experienced that in my own journey. Like, I feel like I lost myself for a good 10 years of my life. And because I was so all consumed by the eating disorder that I lost a lot of other things, fell away from me. So helping the clients getting back, recognizing what are their passions, what did they used to love before, what makes them light up, right? And then the journal is, of course, a really useful tool, a place we work a lot. And I do also find, like, the nutritional teaching I find is really impactful. Teaching about how blood sugar works, like foundations. What are carbs, proteins, fats? Why do we need them? How do they work in the body? Foundational stuff about what's happening with the digestive system, and all those little pieces of information. I think they just help the clients understand the basic physiology of what is meant to happen when we eat food, so that they can start to kind of really picture it differently and understand it differently. And then, of course, we're always really working on the mind gut connection, and intuitive eating practices are really beneficial. Slow eating, deep breathing, and then, of course, supporting them with stress and anxiety, depression, that along the same vein. So really in that kind of holistic wheel.
Yeah.
But I guess there's some specific strategies for the eating disorders weaved in there as well.
That's really interesting that you kind of touch on all of those pieces, because I'm like a firm believer that it's like true health has to start with self-care. Like, you cannot feed into no pun intended, guys. You can't feed into like the nutrition piece or the like fitness piece or the stress piece or the sleep piece if you're not ready to take care of yourself. And so it's like kind of doing the trauma, undoing some of the maybe like disconnection between mind and body, mind and gut, mind and intuition. Like we always say, like, trust your gut, like that intuition that is missing. And when those pieces kind of come back, everything else becomes much simpler to do. And it doesn't become an obsession. It becomes from a place of self-care and self-love, instead of having it like almost like a torture mechanism. Like, I didn't do this well enough, so I'm going to just do this in return.
Yeah, I love that.
It's something that I've kind of been like, of course I said, like I always question whether or not I have an eating disorder or something like that, but it's like, am I doing this out of self-love, or am I doing this as a destructive behavior? And that's really like when I'm trying to decipher whether this is for my health or for, or can I let go just a little bit just to, feel a little bit more free with my health concerns, because it is like a balance. Like, you are managing, a lot of times you're managing these conditions, and it can be really difficult to know, like, am I doing it because it's good for me, or am I doing it because I think something bad is going to happen?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a challenge. And I also, like, another thing that I thought of, like, while we were talking before too, is like, I have my son has allergies, and so they're getting better over time. And so we can be less restrictive with what he eats. But then, there's all these other things, like we'll let him eat something that he normally probably wouldn't, but then his behavior shifts, or he'll wet the bed or something like that. And you're like, okay, well, that was worth it. But do I want to be doing the laundry after, like letting him do that and letting him see the shifts in his like mental change too. Like, if he eats, obviously with his allergies, it's a whole gut issue, but it's like, if he eats a ton of sugar, like what happens to him mentally and emotionally after he eats that? And he'll binge on it, which is really sad. And it's like hard for me, because it's like these allergies create these behaviors, and because he's finally like let into like this little kingdom of sugar, or into the kingdom of things that he wouldn't normally get to eat, then he kind of binges and goes off like the back end. And it's like, okay, am I setting him up for success around, being conscientious about what he's putting in his body, because it could really hurt him? Or am I creating more of a problem down the line with like making sure we're like trying to get rid of these allergies in the first place? It's tricky.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance with raising kids, for sure, because you don't want them to feel like you're controlling or you are restricting them too much. They need to have an element of food freedom, especially like I have a teenager now. So, that's a whole other ball game. So it's tricky, like you said, and I don't think there's a formula. I think there's just doing as best as you can, and always supplying them with really good food and lots of information and lots of encouragement. And then, as they get older, I think you have to trust you've done the best that you can, and let them take it from there.
And I think that's really important, because if we think back to like how we were as teenagers, back to like the whole marketing piece of like, I feel like food marketing really started when we were younger. I don't think we're too far from each other's age, but I think that it started then, and you start to wonder like how much of that is really ingrained in us, and how is it now playing out with kids on social media, kids on, YouTube, watching all of these videos. Like, we very rarely let my son watch YouTube, but there's like this Just Eat commercial, and it like plays 100 times a day. And it's like, what is, how do we navigate all of these things and hope that, that they come out better on the other side? Because I do see a lot of like what we went through as kids kind of surfacing now in what I recognize in myself too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. I honestly, I just think we do the best we can. Just do the best we can. And there's no right or wrong, it's just love, compassion, firm boundaries, teach them well.
Fair.
Right.
I love it.
Yeah.
Well, I want to end the podcast with telling us what is inspiring you at the moment.
Oh, that's tough, because I am really just always inspired. I, I'm not a person who has a lack of inspiration. I burn out every once in a while, and then I have to regroup and put it all back together. But, yeah, I'm I am actually quite inspired by some networking that I've been doing recently. I realized where I live, I've mentioned Nelson because it's more people tend to know where that is, but actually live in a tiny little town called Weimar of like 300 people in the mountains, and it's beautiful. And I love this rural life. And it's lonely, and it's can be challenging as a practitioner to not have other practitioners around me. And so it's kind of like my goal moving forward into the new year is to put out more feelers and do more networking, and maybe do some offerings by teaming up with other practitioners and learning from others out there. So I guess that's really inspiring me. It's inspiring me to branch out. I'm also really inspired by this program that I'm doing with Josh Gatalis, who's just like functional medicine guru and a really incredible teacher. And so I'm just learning so much more in-depth information about gut health, mental health, um, like consulting practices and all of that. And that's really just given me more foundational information to work with, which is super inspiring.
Yeah, I think functional medicine is definitely like once you take the holistic nutritionist like training of any kind, like diving into functional medicine and seeing, I mean, a lot of our training is based on like naturopathy, functional medicine, and things like that. But it's amazing to hear them speak and dig into it. And I love like the whole collaborative piece. That's like my word for the year is like collaboration, like how can we collaborate together as practitioners to make the industry like stronger and change the industry and the view of the industry too, right? Like kind of take the name that we're not just like, I use this term all the time on the podcast, but like snake oil salesman, like we do have a lot to offer. And I think a lot of people have many, many different certifications and many different skill sets. And if we can find a way to collectively come together and share those things, it becomes even more powerful. And that's, I mean, ultimately one reason why I'm trying to get as many practitioners on the podcast as I possibly can to be like, hey, we are all out here. We all are doing the work. We all can be successful. Like, how can we do that? And how can we support each other in doing that?
Yeah, so good. Strength in numbers. It's so good.
100%. So
Yeah.
I thank you obviously for coming on the podcast today. Last thing before we leave, what is the one book? I did ask you about the favorite book, but then we decided what's the one book that you use the most in your practice?
Yeah. I always go back to my text from Holistic Nutrition, which is like, what's that called? Staying Healthy with Nutrition. So
Yeah.
I go back to that for functional, like not for functional, for like fundamental things. I do
Yeah.
go back to that a lot. The other one I use, which I cross-reference with, is the natural medicine, the Encyclopedia for Natural Medicine.
Mm.
Use that one a lot too. And as far as eating disorder recovery stuff goes, I use the intuitive eating principles. So I use that book a lot. And one that I've been really excited about lately is called The 8 Keys for Recovering from an Eating Disorder. And that is by Carolyn something. It's that woman who runs the recovery coaching program in Vancouver. And that one's been useful too. But all the books, I'm like a chronic book buyer. I
Me
can't
too.
help myself. I'm like, I want to know that too.
Me too. And I think we're all chronic learners in this realm. And I think we all should be. I mean, there's nothing wrong with learning, but it's like how do you decipher and take all of that information and turn it into something that's actually usable in our practice and our business. But keep reading because we need it.
That's
Yeah.
right. Thank you.
Anyways, I want to say thank you for being here today. I really appreciate your time. I hope that this helps, somebody somewhere. I'm sure it will. And yeah, I appreciate you sharing your journey and a bit of your knowledge with us. If people want to find you or connect with you, where's the best place to do that?
On my website, cindyspratt.com, pretty much all my info is up there, and that's a great way to get a hold of me. Can email directly through the website. That's great.
Awesome. All right.